The big one on the front, of course, with Johnson grass, Bermuda. Field bindweed is the common term for the morning glory, and nut sedge is nut grass, which is a problem in some cases. So that's the big ones there. But then you can turn over the page, and I think Mr. Fisher has done an excellent job of summarizing the whole story on herbicides, pre-plant, post-plant, new vineyards, established vineyards here, on which weeds to kill with what chemical. Yeah, it was taken care of. I was going to say Princep is Simazin, but Frank made the correction there before he ran these off. So this is just reference material for yourself. Of course, for the exams, otherwise you really ought to know that front page pretty well. But remember that we do not use MSMA in bearing vineyards. I'm surprised it says here in non-bearing, and I'm not sure whether that's approved for non-bearing or not, but before you put it on, you better check up. Okay, remember you're having a midterm Monday. It'll be the usual type, 14, 15, 16 questions. I might even throw in some true and false this time just to make it easy to grade. But I'll put the exams on reserve by 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock tomorrow. Half a dozen or so in the main library, 2 or 3 sets in our viticulture library. And if some of those exams can be Xeroxed, I'll Xerox a bunch and put it on the table there in the Vit library so you don't have to laboriously copy the questions off the old exam.
Can you pull your microphone?
It's going to be put in the smoke. Thank you. Okay, remember now in writing these exams, my general policy is to make it a speed exam. And that means that you don't want to take time to write out the whole question before you answer it, for crying out loud. A lot of you do that. You write the whole question out before you answer it. I want the answer in the shortest, simplest terms you can give. And you answer it, and give yourself plenty of space. Answer all of it as fast as you can, as brief as you can, and then go back, and if you have extra time, fill in on it after that. And of course, you need blue books, and we want those standard size. I yell that at you because 3 or 4 of you still insist on bringing in the big ones. And you can't shuffle a deck of cards if you've got some of them twice as big as others. And we like to shuffle them in between grading each one. So be sure to bring a standard size blue book, a couple of sharp pencils or pen, and as Ali says, turn on your mind before you turn on your pencil. We hate to go through that first 2 or 3 sentences while you're thinking and just doodling them on the paper and then have to hunt for the answer. So there's only 3 or 4 new students in here. The rest of you have had a couple of exams, so you know what to expect. The best way to study for the exam, of course, is to go look at the old exams. And we rarely give more than 4 or 5 new questions, but we grade them pretty hard. One thing that should be called to your attention, of course, is the fact that we now have an employment bulletin board with job opportunities and so forth in the west end of the building on that bulletin board behind the stairway. And we're trying to keep that current now with the job opportunities that come in and take them off as jobs are filled. So you ought to watch that board if you're interested in employment. And remember that the committee, I'm representing viticulture, and Dr. Conkey and Dr. Guyman are representing the wine and brandy industry. And if you really are ready for a job when school's out this summer, you certainly ought to write up a little short resume of your background, training, maybe the important courses you've had, certainly any practical experience you've had, and give it to one of the 3 of us. What else I want to say? One thing, you should have had this TV camera in my office this morning, because if you've ever seen a professor panic, it's when he's lost his teaching notes 10 minutes before the lecture. I made the mistake of starting in to straighten up my office the other day, and I filed this, filed this lecture in a different file, and it took me about 20 minutes to find it, so I didn't spend much time getting it ready. I'm sorry. We'll see how it works out. Okay, some of you said that we went over this thing pretty fast last time. Hopefully I'm going to try to quit soon enough today so that you can ask some questions. But remember these terms, these definitions of field capacity, wilting point, available moisture. Remember that, that the grapevine needs absolutely no shortage, or does not want any shortage of water during this period from now up through bloom time and the end of this so-called grand period of growth. Okay, and then we were talking about how to determine whether or not you need soil moisture, and I showed you those slides. I point out that, that the textbook shows the theoretical amount of water needed for the various regions, depending on whether you're growing a wine, raisin, or table. I kind of think some of those are a little bit exaggerated, but perhaps not. And then we wanted to, and I told you that the time and frequency and amount of water needed depends on the heat region, of course, and the frequency depends on the soil texture and soil depth as the reservoir, how much it can hold. Now, the one thing that we just touched on briefly there when you're getting ready to leave was the added need for water during girdling of table grapes. That, if you remember from 116A lab, we talked about xylem and phloem, so forth, and pith here in the middle. But obviously this is, as you get closer to the center, the wood is older and older and older, so that your most active xylem is the most recent 1-year-old wood out here that contains the vessels through which the water moves upward, so that you're getting by far your most efficient upward movement of water out in the perimeter. And then if you go in with a girdling tool and cut all that off clear into the wood, you cut out the most active xylem tissue that you have, the most active xylem tissue you have, which means that you've essentially put the vine on crutches for getting water. So the one way you help it, of course, is to irrigate immediately after you get through girdling to give it, the root system, all the water it can possibly use. We talked about table grapes and how you want to irrigate those up as far as possible. The big problem, of course, with wine grapes and particularly with raisin grapes is whether or not to irrigate in September or October. Because if you do irrigate, if you pick up your grapes, your raisins, after they've been in the sun for 6 or 8 weeks, and then put on a good irrigation, you could conceivably start the vine into new growth. We haven't done it at Kearney in our experiment, but there might be some shallow soils, some very sandy soils, where this long 2 months of drying out essentially gives you the treatment for dormancy that is practiced in some of these countries like India and the Taiwan, not Taiwan, but the South, well, what country I'm thinking of, Thailand, in those areas where they depend on the drought instead of cold weather to cause dormancy, and then you go in and put the water back to them real quickly, and this breaks the dormancy. Well, we don't want to break the dormancy, of course, but it's sometimes done. I have seen it in my famous references to Mexico. I have seen it there where they let them dry out and then put on water, and the shoots break out and grow about that far, just long enough to ruin the fruit clusters, and then winter frost comes, of course, and you've killed your crop for the next year. Now we want to discuss for a moment, no, I want to go first for these we're talking about water use, and I've got a little bit of data on water use here to give to you. First, the paper that is usually assigned for the class to read is well worth reading. I have about 6 copies I can put on reserve in the bit library, but that's all I have left. And I'll give you the highlights of this paper. but this is vineyard irrigation trials by Vadia and Casamatas, and it's in the American Journal of Enology. And Viticulture, volume 12. That's also on the shelves in the library if you can't check this one out. Number 2, 1961. And this was a 2-year study on irrigation of grapes here at Davis, out in our own vineyards, right where you're working. And they made various and sundry measurements. I'll give you the highlights of it, and then I'll tell you what I want you to remember. They had 3 treatments, one in which they gave 3 6-inch irrigations, one with 2 6-inch irrigations, and one control with no irrigation at all. And under those conditions of the maximum irrigation of 3 6-inch irrigations, during the 3 months of June, July, and August, they used 23 inches of water. 7 in June, 9 in July, 7 in August, 23 inches of water. As I say, but the non-irrigated one, according to their records at least, only used about 6 inches of water during that period. Okay, what were the results? The wet treatment, as they called it, produced about 3 times as much vine growth as the control. And the two irrigation deal produced about twice as much growth. So it went from twice as much for 2 irrigations to 3 times as much for 3 irrigations. What effect did this have on fruit, which is what you're after? Obviously affected berry size. You got larger berries with more water, and you got obviously then heavier bunches. And certainly then as a result of that you got much greater yields. Here's A was the wet, B was the 2. These are the treatments. And then the yield in tons per acre, this gave 10.6, this gave 6.7, and the dry plot only gave 3.1. That would help you to know which variety that was, and I forgot myself. Just a moment, we'll find it here. A Chenin Blanc. This is Chenin Blanc. At Davis. And this looks like that the real story lies in pouring the water on then. But here's the percent rot. And the irrigated plot gave 8.8% rotten berries. This gave 4.3, and this gave no rot at all with the Chenin Blanc in that year. The weight of the prunings, which I said reflected, well, they said the shoot growth was 3, 2, and 1, but the final weight of the prunings doesn't show that much. So this refers back again perhaps to some of the principles of pruning. The total weight of prunings was 4.9 pounds per vine, 4.4, and 2.0. So it looked like in this situation here at Davis that 2 irrigations, 2 6-inch irrigations, is probably the most economical. Actually, Mr. Tyree is telling me out there that we don't irrigate here at Davis, but we do. We irrigate wine grapes once and table grapes twice, because we need the quality, of course, on the table fruit. And this caused, those are the main highlights. There was no real difference in effect on wine. There was a day or so difference in maturity. The wet plot was a day or 2 late, but the paper, if you read it, doesn't really tell you that, because they waited for these grapes to get ripe. Well, they picked them all at roughly the same sugar content, but the A plot was a day or so later than the control. But when they ran through the color tests, the color comparisons on the wine and the taste panel on the wine, there was no measurable pickup of any differences analytically or organoleptically among these three treatments of Chenin Blanc. Now, I think that's about the highlights. The one thing the weakness of the paper that they had, which was a big weakness, was not even the dry plot was ever really dry before harvest. That used to be a quiz question when you had to read the assignment, because in there, even the dry plot with no irrigation at all, the soil did not reach the permanent wilting point by harvest time, even at 6 feet. So it isn't a dry plot, in my interpretation. So except for that, those are the highlights. They did get quite noticeably lower nitrate in the petioles, and quite strikingly less potassium in these dry plots. Remember, I said potassium is affected by drought. So they did get visible, clearly visible potassium deficiency in that dry plot. Okay, that's one area of response to grape growing, to irrigation. Let's jump to one that you might be more interested in. I'm just trying to pick a few examples here. One of the ones which comes out rather interesting, and it came out as a sort of an incidental thing in the work that Dr. Leiter and I were doing in Napa Valley on nutrition and varieties, and we summarized all the data. This is a relatively interesting paper if you want to read it, if you're interested in tissue analysis. If I can find the front of it here. These are not required readings because I don't think in this course you're going to have time to do it. But this is a long title, but let's just say mineral composition. With relation to rootstock and variety in Napa Valley. And we conducted this over a period of years. This is by Cook and Leiter. In the proceedings of American Society of Horticulture, ASHS is the way that you should learn to refer to these things. And this is page 240, this is volume 84. Page 243 on in 1964. So that might be of some interest to you. But now to get to what we're talking about, one of the things which we were rather interested in was this. Now, taken from 1955, 56, 57, 58, 59, and 60. I just want to show you this trend. And given the total rainfall, here's the total rainfall. We had 16 inches this year, 47 inches, 19, 45, 23, these are inches, total inches, not effective inches, and 26. Okay, here are the yields, the average yields for that period for AXR rootstock. This is on AXR, just to give you an example. And this year they got 7.5 tons per acre, overall average for all the varieties. This year we got 10 tons. This was 7.25. I think this will emphasize the whole picture here. 10.1 tons, 8.7, and 8.3. Now, do you see what a good correlation there is between the rainfall? This is a non-irrigated vineyard. And you see with 16 inches total rain, they got 7.5 tons. With 47 inches, they got 10 tons. With 45 inches, they got 10 tons. And here in this range, 19 and 16 both gave about the same. A little bit more over here, raise your yield a little bit more yet. Yes?
How much does that super rainfall, like that 47 inches, delay the drying out down to the root zone of the soil?
What?
Well, you say that Napa Valley usually has a water table of 2 feet in June. How much
Yeah.
does this affect that water table when you have a super rain?
Well, remember most of that water, I think it keeps it there. Because, of course, if you get the rain out in the vineyard, you're getting it on the mountains, and that water table is really is water coming underground off the hills. So it would keep that water table there longer through the summer, I think.
Would this decrease the performance of the grapes?
Decrease what?
The performance of the vine?
Well,
I know
it didn't. Now, if you've got those roots, you see, if you've got the roots, of course, the roots that are completely well down in it, a foot down below the water table, they may be dying off, but the ones that are just 3 or 4 inches from it are probably tipping their toes in it and continuing to grow along pretty well. But out of this paper that we published, I think this is the most interesting data. And it's why I've told some of you in private conversations that if you can put in a vineyard setup so that you can give at least 1 3 or 4 inch irrigation along about 1st of July in these coastal counties, it can really pay off. Because this 45 inches, obviously, as he's pointing out, a lot of it is wasted and maybe have been slightly detrimental. But if you had the 16 inches and then along about the middle of July put 4 more inches on it, I think that's what you would like to have. To answer your question, yeah. But those 2 big years with lots of rain gave us our big yields. Well, we had 22 varieties, so, but some of them rot, some of them don't, I guess. I don't really recall on that. We didn't try to measure rot there in that particular experiment. Okay, that's Davis, Region 4, and the coastal so-called Region 2 or 3, depending on whether you're reading the new edition or the old one. And then to give a little more results here then from, I'm just giving you some sort of odd data. Now here's some results on irrigation of Tokay's and Lodi. And I'm not going to give you the total deal, but on an experiment there where they tried to measure pretty carefully the water usage, they used 25 inches on this block of Tokay's at Lodi. Yet if you look in the table, it'll say, I think that you need about 30 inches of water there. Well, 25 isn't far from 30. So the summary of his work there was that table grapes did require 30 to 36 acre inches, but in this particular trial, on a good soil, good deep soil, they used 25 inches, and here's the difference, of course. He used 25 inches from the 1st of May to the end of September. If any of you want the date and dope, it's for May is 4.6, June 4.9, July 6.2, August 5.3. So see, it averaged just about 5 inches per month at Lodi. Now in Delano, on a raisin trial down there, they calculated that they used 34 inches in Delano. That would be in a real warm Region 4, if not Region 5, at Delano. But once again, I want to point out that sometimes you can put on too much water. You see, Vadi and Cass put on really too much water for in the bunch rot problem and delayed maturity a little bit. But down in Fresno County, they put on an experiment in which they had some vineyards that got 5 irrigations between bud break and harvest. And this is table fruit, now table Thompsons, where you want to pick them fairly soon. And where they put on 5 irrigations versus 3 irrigations during the season. And then packed out the table Thompsons, and they just packed out. They only counted what they packed out. They didn't count out the strippings or the culls. but in the wet plot, that is with 5 irrigations, they packed out on the size of the plot, they packed out 78 lugs on an average in this replicated plot. And on the dry, which was 3 irrigations, they packed out 94 lugs. So just like all these other things that I tell you about, you don't want to go to extremes. You don't want to over-irrigate, you don't want to under-irrigate. And in this dry treatment, in that particular area, and I can hardly believe this data, but that's what it says, that they used only 20.3 inches of water. Used that. They said they did not count runoff and leaching water and so on. So they saturate the soil and they start taking soil moisture samples and calculating it to get back to how much was actually used. Okay, then, so much then for sort of a once-over lightly on some of the effects of irrigation. The one thing that we have not talked about is how to irrigate young vineyards, or the fact that the young vines need it. We do have a publication showing the results on that, and I'm sorry I didn't bring that one in included, in which Leiter and Casamatas and Bowers over at our vineyards over there measured the vine response growth with these first-year rootings that were planted, whether they were irrigated at all, or once, or twice, or 3 times, I believe. And of course, obviously, you got far increasingly better growth with these young vines during that first year. This is fairly important in any situation you're going into. If you're not going to go to sprinkler irrigation for frost protection, which can later on be used for irrigation, then you've got to really provide for the funds necessary for hand watering of these young vines in the first and second year. Okay, now I wanted to show you a few, well, before we turn the lights off and go into it, because I don't have any slides on that, we want to go into various methods of irrigation now, techniques, irrigation techniques. And we might as well start with what was going to be my last one and talk about it first. As most of you know, there's a terrific amount of interest today in all crops for drip irrigation. And Dr. Al Jabari down at our station at Kearney has been taking the lead in this, and has given a lot of talks and a lot of publicity about the results that they've been getting with drip irrigation. It's being used, as I say, experimentally, and now it's moving out of the experimental stage into real practice with a number of crops, and we're going that way pretty strong on grapes. There must be 500 acres or more in Napa Valley under drip irrigation at the moment. It's still in a sort of a partial state of development, and basically what it is that you spread hoses throughout the vineyard, either under the ground or on the surface of the soil, and then the technique is that there's about a half a dozen different inventions, developments of little devices which will reduce the pressure in the line by resistance with coil outlets and so forth, so that the water drips out of the hose. You put the hose under about 20 or 30 pounds pressure, and then these little devices will allow the water to drip, usually at 1 or 2 gallons per hour. And then you put one dripper under each vine, and this is a technique that had its origin in Israel, where they were really hard up for water, and now it's being spread certainly to most of the arid regions of the world. I have not been able to get any real good, yet at least any real good solid estimates on what it costs, but the rumor, of course, is that it costs about $500 an acre to install. It does have some problems, which are being worked on. You can get some salt built up around the perimeter of this wet pot that you're growing the vine in now. Because, see, the whole idea is that the vine is standing here, And instead of you having to irrigate the whole middles along here and so forth to get to the vine, you put the dripper right under it, and the only area that gets wet is this bowl right around the vine. And you can, but I've heard Knowledge Bear talk twice now, but he still hasn't given me, so far as I know, any measurements of the exact water saving you get by this. And this should be the most important thing, to make some measurements on how much water is actually used by this drip irrigation. It has some real problems in that those outlets are down to such an extremely small diameter that the slightest little bit of contamination in the water plugs them up. So they have to have an elaborate set of filters, usually 3 stages or so of filters, to filter the water down to absolute clarity before it goes into the lines. Otherwise, you spend all your time cleaning out those or replacing those little outlets. But these problems are being worked out, and I think you'll see more and more of this type of irrigation going in. Other than that, we go to the various types of furrow irrigation. I'm going to show you some slides in a moment. But in general, under furrow irrigation, we would like to have the furrows as broad and shallow as possible. And this is extremely true if you're working with salty soils, because you want to leach the area down each time as much as possible. If you put it in a little narrow furrows like that, the water goes down here, and then capillary brings the salt back up to the surface. So what you want to do each time is to cover as much of the surface as you can with the water to push the salt from last irrigation down, down, and down. Okay, let's just look at this series of slides then. Let me get the lights in. Yeah. Where's the small pointer? Oh, yeah. I like this one, though. It's better. Can you catch them? If I can pitch them. We got all sorts of pointers. We got one there in the corner. Now, of course, with young vines where the root system is not out yet, out into the middles, you've got to get the water in fairly close. And I guess this may be probably the origin of that Mexican system I was showing you last time, in that if they've got to put a furrow next to them when they first plant them, then they just decide, well, that's a place to keep the furrow. But you see, there's no point in watering this whole dry stretch here when you've got young vines whose root system probably doesn't even come out to here. But this is a young vineyard down in the Lodi area, going up the stake, as you see, out of these protective collars, and this way to irrigate those. Okay, next slide. So I say that's what probably, that type of starting of the vines probably leads to this Mexican system, which I told you just cultivates the Johnson grass that you can see along the sides and leaves the center ridge dry, which is not a good idea. Okay, next slide. It's better to do this. See, here's a modification, leaving a berm, as they call it, B-E-R-M, a ridge underneath the vine row in which the water doesn't get up high enough to wet this surface area in here and cause seeds to germinate. And some people have the idea, well, here's where the vine is and its roots are under there, I want to put the water out here. But obviously, by the time the vine is this old, the root system is pretty well out in the middles quite a bit too. One of the bad things about this, which I hadn't thought of before till looking at it now, of course, is that, can somebody fix that one, please? Is that when you have this type of system and irrigate in these 2 broad furrows, when you go through to put on sulfur dust, you can see the tractor tracks, they're going right on top of the wet soil. Some growers down in Visalia have even gone to the what I call the Mexican system. That is to put a narrow furrow right down the middle of this, and then leave these as 2 high ridges, and then sort of leave a French plow furrow under the vine.
Don't they often irrigate every other row?
And, yeah, well,
So they can sulfur dust down one.
I said after a month after bloom you can go to that, but until bloom time they usually irrigate every row. But under the system I'm talking about where the bicellular growers and so on do it in a sort of a French plow. Remember they don't pull the foliage back up and work it back into the vine. They let it hang down over, and it's in the shade really, so it discourages grass growth anyway. The system I'm talking about in Mexico is where they put the furrow real close to it and then very carefully and expensively weave all the growth back out of the way so that you get a wet area exposed to light and get good weed growth in those situations. Okay, next slide. This is in Mexico, by the way. You can back up just quickly, Mark. You can tell by the great posts, these types of posts that they cut. Often they have cement in posts, or big cement posts ever so often, and then in between these sticks, as I call them, estacas, to hold up the growth in between. And this, to say, you would recognize as a Mexican theme because all the growth has been carefully woven back into there so that about half the leaves are in the shade. And Dr. Cleaver will talk to you about the ill effects of that later on. Here's an American vineyard, and with two broad, shallow furrows that really wet from here to here, but leave this part under the vine dry. And that's the ideal way to do it. And then put on the water slowly enough so that it does what we call subs, wets clear across from here to here. And this is the first irrigation in the spring just before bud break. Next slide. Yes?
How come when they plowed back, the French plow on one side didn't plow back on the other?
I don't know. You go ask them. Here's another one where it's a broad furrow basin. You just flood it, but leaving these big high berms on each side. And this is ideal if you've got a setup where that you can work it this way and where you can get the water through. This individual middle irrigation, see, isn't bad. The system that was wrong in Mexico, where I said that they showed you that slide where they irrigated from way over here to way over here, was that they did not put a ridge under each row, which meant then, of course, that you see this type of irrigation, the herbicide that's under this row isn't going to get the leaching that you get with the water movement down out here. And another thing with the basin system as used down there where they irrigate about 4 rows at once is this matter of this alternate middle irrigation after mid-season. How can you alternate middle irrigate when you're irrigating 3 or 4 rows at a time? And that was the main point I was trying to get across to them, that they want to slow that growth down, prevent winter injury. They've got to put ridges under each vine so they can have this one irrigated and that one dry and the next one irrigated and so forth after mid-season to sort of slow it down. Next slide. Well, here's some innovations then. Now we go to the sprinkler irrigation setup, and we're going to advance some here in a moment, but this is the portable system, which was used for a number of years and required quite a bit of manpower. If you irrigate with this thing and wet over to here for 24 hours, then somebody's got to go in there and slog through the mud and pick up these aluminum pipes, which are not heavy, but of course they're slogging through mud to move it over. But that was done and is done in a number of the older vineyards. This particular grower was a little bit cagey and brought in a new idea. He put 100-foot hoses on his sprinklers so that he could irrigate them in line with the piping and then move them 100 feet over this way without moving the pipe, and then 100 feet over this way without moving the pipe, which meant that he only had to move the pipes 1/3 as often. And if you irrigated this one first for 24 hours, then moved it over and irrigated there 24 hours, if you wanted to come back this way and just do 2 at a time, then you could walk in on soil that didn't pretty well drain before you move the hoses. I argued with him whether or not that system would pay for these 100-foot heavy-duty hoses, and he argued that he'd already checked it out, and it was economical. Next slide. And here's just another example of that type of thing. This happens to be Italian Swiss colony. The other one was, excuse me, is way over on the east side of the San Joaquin Valley. But here is Italian Swiss, in which they have permanent mains, as all of them had to have, and then move the portable hose over and over and over to take care of this setup. They run these about 24 hours, let's say, 12 to 24 hours. Next slide. And then we go, this is the best slide I could come up with, what we call permanent set sprinklers. And this is the permanent set sprinkler system. See, the lines are already in, and about within a vine row, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So every fourth vine and every fourth row has one of these. These are the frost. This is that shot from the frost study I talked to you about before. But by setting these things up, every fourth vine and every fourth row, you come up with sprinklers that are about 32 by 48 feet. And you can use them for frost protection as well as for putting on irrigation water, if you have the irrigation water. Remember, one of the difficulties, though, is that on this type of sprinkler irrigation only puts on 1/10 of an inch per hour, because that's what it's set for frost protection, 1/10 or 0.12 or so of water per hour. So if you want to put on in 24 hours, then you'd put on roughly 2.5 inches of water. And in some soils, you may want to put on more water than that. Now, that would mean that you have to run it 36 hours without a stop. And I'm not sure that that's a good thing, because we have had one instance in which a grower left those on for 3 days, and he ran into some real problems. I think if I've not discussed it with anybody and talked much about it, but I think if I were using sprinklers of this type for irrigation, if I needed more than 22.5 inches of water, I think I would irrigate for 24 hours and then stop for 1 day and then go back for another 24 hours, just to give the vines a chance to catch their breath, so to speak, and get a little sunlight, dry off. Okay, next slide. And this one you've also seen. This is Almaden's vineyards down at Piscinas under their sprinkler system, with, as you can see, about every fourth row or so being with the lines in it. This costs $1,000 an acre, remember, to including the reservoir and the pumps and setup and so forth to put in today, maybe $1,100 by now. Okay, next slide, or is that it? And of course, here's our system for, see, we have this 600 or 800 gallon tank, and go through by hand and make basins around these young vines, and then give each one about 10 gallons of water about 3 times during the year. That gets expensive in manpower and labor, and that's why they're arguing that we ought to go in and put in the drip irrigation instead. So we're trying to set up an experiment to compare this type of system versus nothing at all versus the drip system over at Oakville Station, if I can ever get over there in the next 2 weeks or so to set it up. I think that is the last slide. Yeah. Okay, lights. Now, one question which always comes up, so before you ask it, I'll tell you. The question comes up that you say the grapevine doesn't want rain in the summertime, and yet here you are advocating sprinkler irrigation. Aren't you going to encourage mildew and bunch rot? Well, of course you're going to encourage bunch rot if you're sprinkling right up within 10 days or so of harvest. But up until berry zone, as we call it, or mid-season, berries begin to get ripe. We have not found any evidence of effect on mildew and so on from sprinkler irrigation. And it's obvious when you stop to think, but sometimes you don't stop to think about it, that when we're on situations where you're going to have mildew problems from summer rain, you've got rain occurring over 10 square miles, let's say, around your vineyard. And then when the rain stops, it may be humid in that area for a day or so. But here you're irrigating 10 acres in the middle of 50 square miles with sprinklers, and with our low humidity that we have here in the summertime, an hour or so after you turn off your sprinklers, that foliage is dry. So the only point is that when you do put on sprinkler irrigation, you've got to go in as soon as possible after that and once again put on sulfur dust to control the mildew. because you have to keep the growth protected, but you're not going to get the mildew problems like powder, downy mildew and so on from the sprinkler irrigation itself. But if you wash all the sulfur off the leaves, you've got to go back in and cover them again. So sprinkler irrigation does require a sulfuring after you get through. Well, I was going to have time for questions, but we got about 1 or 2 minutes. Anybody got a question?
How much do you have to water young vines when you first plant them?
Well, of course, again, it depends on soil texture and depth and where you're planting them. Those are the 3 things you got to remember. But generally speaking, I said in Napa Valley, we feel it ideal to irrigate those rooted vines like you're planting out in the vineyard about 3 times during the first year. But these potted vines, these little 6-inch potted vines, which many of you are going to be buying, they get irrigated about every day for the first week, and then after that about twice a week, and then about once a week. So you wind up giving them sprinkler irrigation about 15 times in that first summer.
I'm in the Central Valley and I'm irrigating with sprinklers. I don't want to go more than 24 hours at a time irrigating. Could I irrigate 24 hours, or I can go a day, irrigate 24 hours again? Will I have to put that sulfur on every time and stop?
No, oh no, you wouldn't have to do it for the 24 hours in between, but because it takes a few days for it to build up. But certainly, as soon as you could possibly get into the vineyard after that sulfuring or watering, and even where you furrow irrigate, this is the point I left on, even where you furrow irrigate, you ought to get in just as soon as you can after the soil gets dry enough to get on and give it a sulfur dusting, because with that, it isn't the humidity that causes the mildew so much as it is the coolness under the vine caused by the wet soil. And so you've got to get in and dust as soon as you can after a furrow irrigation in the summertime. Okay, they had a lab yesterday afternoon in spite of the rain, and I guess unless it doesn't look like it's going to rain today, so we'll have afternoon lab today and plant vineyard and do some crown suckering. And God help you Monday.